arms towards the sun. You feel the warmth of the rays, and then you know you're alive.
Welcome to the Bassline. Dr. Piers Robinson is a co-director of the Organization of Propaganda Studies, research director for the International Center for 9/11 Justice, co-editor for the Journal of 9/11 Studies, and a co-editor for Propaganda in Focus. I am pleased to be joined this afternoon by the distinguished Dr. Piers Robinson. How are you this evening, Dr. Robinson?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. I say this afternoon for me and this evening for you because you're in Berlin. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. It's just going into evening here, getting a little bit dark now, so.
Excellent. So we want to dive right into this conversation here. And the first thing I'd like people to be aware of is this incredible journal, which is Propaganda in Focus. Can you tell us about Propaganda in Focus? What is its mission, for one, and how do people start delving into the trove of material that you guys have compiled?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me on. It's really good to talk to you and to meet you, so to speak, virtually. Propaganda in Focus, and I know you've written for us in the past for Propaganda in Focus.
Yeah, it was a great honor, actually. Check out my 2 articles on Propaganda in Focus.
But great pieces you wrote for us.
Thank you.
Now, where this idea came from was initially when I was still working in mainstream academia. Myself and a number of colleagues were sort of becoming very, very aware of how little academics were paying serious attention to propaganda in Western liberal democracies. It's almost as if it was a forbidden subject, that you weren't supposed to talk about it as an academic. And this is way back in 2017-18 that these ideas were really crystallizing in my mind. And myself, Professor Mark Crispin Miller, who I know you're friends with from New York University.
Love that guy.
And also Professor David Miller and also Professor Chris Simpson, we banded together and thought, well, we need to set up an organization for propaganda studies in order to lay down a marker for other academics about the importance of this subject, which is being ignored effectively. And that gave birth to TOPS, which is we still have running as effectively as a fledgling research organization. So I haven't developed to the extent that I want to. But one of the main things which has come out of that has been setting up a Propaganda in Focus, which is essentially it's a halfway between an academic journal and a more public orientated news format publication. And the idea of it was to really provide a platform for primarily initially academics, researchers who wanted to write about propaganda, felt constrained about talking about propaganda and writing about propaganda within academia, that this would be an outlet for them to write what they really wanted to write, but also to provide a platform for researchers and academics who were managing to get material published on propaganda to get more publicly orientated versions of that out into the public domain. And that essentially was the starting point, and that's what Propaganda in Focus does. I run it with Professor Dan Brody and also Mark Crispin Miller, who are co-editors. And since we set this up, we have now over 200 articles published. We have over 50 mainly credentialed academics writing for us. And what we're trying to do is, we're not just about trying to get people to understand propaganda and how it works and how it's actually very prevalent even in liberal democracies, but also so we want to get people to understand that, but we also want to get people to understand the big issues out there which have been highly propagandized. So in a nutshell, this is not just about trying to explain how propaganda works and theorizing about propaganda, which is important to do, of course. It's also about looking at the big issues out there which are subject to very high levels of propaganda, and which, in a sense, the truth is buried, at least within mainstream academia and within the mainstream media. So I know when we set this up, and I remember having this conversation with Mark Crispin Miller when we set up the OPS, was really recognizing the importance of tackling and getting writing out on a really big issues. And so the assassinations in the 60s and 70s, starting with JFK, but also Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, those, what some people have described as these deep events in US politics. The assassinations, 9/11, of course, and I know we're going to get to that a little bit later in this conversation.
Yes.
9/11, but also COVID-19,
Yeah.
these big, massive events which occur, which are subject to very high levels of propaganda, and which is nearly always something, the official story is wildly inaccurate or straightforwardly untrue.
Right.
And we need to get people thinking and recognizing what's really going on in these big, major issues, events in our history, in our recent history, and to try and have a journal where this would be spoken and written about as a matter of course. Yeah, that it would be not a problem to have an article about the JFK assassination or COVID-19 or 9/11, and talk about the nefarious, deceptive components of those events. Essentially, going into that kind of territory of where people are smeared as being conspiracy theorists, for example.
Yeah.
But make sure that those areas are properly addressed and spoken about and researched, so that as a service to democracy, we're helping people to understand the truth of what is going on. And so that's always been a major component of propaganda in focus, in terms of making sure that we try and hit the big issues in terms of our coverage.
Right. Well, go ahead.
We're free to access. Sorry, I'll wrap up on this.
Yeah, please.
We're free at the point of access. We do ask for donations, and we're not primarily set up to make money, but we need to cover our costs. But essentially, everything is free to access. We have a YouTube channel as well. People can go to our website and they can access any of the 200 plus articles we have. Go to the YouTube channel, watch the interviews, which mainly Dan Brody has been hosting those interviews, and people can access. We have material broken into sections: war on conflict, corporate media, technocracy, academia, as well as theory and practice. So there's a rich source of material there, and we have just started to do more educational pieces. And we actually started with Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model. But the idea is to develop essentially a sub-strand within the journal, which is doing the kind of things which we do in an academic setting in terms of teaching people the basics of propaganda. So we're starting work on that at the moment.
Outstanding.
But that's everything in a nutshell.
Yeah, great intro. And this is already one of those interviews where I'm regretting that we don't have a minimum of 3 hours to discuss all of this, because I know we're not going to be able to cover everything, unfortunately, but there's still a lot to talk about. But before we move on, can you just tell us how to find you online? Just repeat that in terms of the primary website, even mention the X account, YouTube you mentioned. Can you just tell us how to, and everyone go grab your pencil or go, start taking a note in your phone, text it to other people. Let's start spreading the word in real time.
Sure. So Propaganda in Focus, the website is propagandainfocus.com, propagandainfocus.com. So www.propagandainfocus.com. That will take you to the website with all the articles. We are functioning on Substack as well, which basically replicates what we have on the website. So if people put in Propaganda and Focus on Substack, we'll turn up there. And the YouTube channel, I think it's probably the easiest thing is people just go to YouTube, type in Propaganda in Focus, and it will come up. Our emblem is a little circular blue sign with a guy with a figure in the center, a black figure. If you put us into Google, we come up on Google. We're reasonably easy to find. But the first port of call is the website, propagandainfocus.com.
Excellent. And also, I'm looking right now at your personal Substack, Dr. Piers Robinson. So everyone, if you're on Substack, which I hope you are by now, PiersRobinson, at Piers Robinson on Substack. And I've read twice now your really outstanding article, The War Against Iran, decades in the making. I strongly recommend you guys check out that article. Go make use of all this really enlightening material on Dr. Robinson's page, as well as at the Propaganda and Focus Substack, etc., the other resources that were just mentioned. Because, it's so frustrating to be in this environment where people are being propagandized, and they even have these opinions about things that they just frankly haven't really researched that much. I mean, you have people who haven't even read one article, let alone a book on a subject, but they have these positions that they're adamant about. And before we get to the subject of 9/11, which I'm really interested in talking with you about, I would love if you could just say a few words about propaganda in general as a phenomenon, because one thing that struck me is I remember reading in the essays of Mao Zedong how he would say that it's your obligation as a communist to carry out propaganda amongst the masses. And it struck me as, wow, propaganda being used in an affirmative sense, whereas growing up in the United States, propaganda meant lies and deceit, and usually it was preceded with the word communist propaganda. That's communist propaganda. So I just found it interesting that in communism, whatever people want to interpret that to be, but in communist essays, you might find that propaganda was something that was your obligation. But growing up in the United States, propaganda necessarily had a negative denotation. Could you talk about just propaganda for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating history, and there are different interpretations of what is meant by propaganda, which touches upon what you were just saying there. I mean, of course, the term itself, propaganda, was coined, so to speak, by the Catholic Church. This was from the Vatican, and it was the idea of propagating the faith. And in that sense, it was when it was being used there, it was being seen as this is a positive part of trying to persuade people to become more religious or to become Catholic. And so that was historically, where the term came from. Propaganda, it's about persuading, it's about propagating the faith, propagating ideas. Not necessarily bad. Obviously, by the 20th century, really most usage of the term propaganda tended to have what you describe as a negative inflection. And, in the early part of the 20th century, whilst it was still common for liberal scholars, academics, and writers to talk about propaganda, they would do so still with this idea that, and this goes back to Eddie Bernays, it goes back to Walter Lippmann, the idea that in democracies you need to engage in a degree of manipulation, intelligent manipulation of the mind, of the masses, is Eddie Bernays' phrase. And this was commonly discussed in the early part of the 20th century, that democracy is fine, but you know what, you can't trust people to come to the right conclusion of their own volition. So you need to manage public opinion, you need to manufacture consent. It's a phrase that Walter Lippmann coined, and which, of course, Hermann Chomsky picked up later in the 20th century. But at that point in the early 20th century, it was essentially an elitist attitude towards democracy, that you need to engage in some level of manipulation. And then really sort of with the way in which propaganda was used in the First and the Second World War, as Eddie Bernays himself famously said, it gave propaganda a bad name. So they had to rebrand propaganda, and public relations was the term which was initially used to replace the term propaganda. As people started to realize that actually this involves a degree of manipulation, that it's not purely persuasion in and of itself, it's also about manipulating people, about potentially deceiving people, or even coercing or incentivizing people to do things or to think things that they wouldn't otherwise do. And so this is where the negative connotation, which you referred to, became sort of more firmly established. And that's where, with the rebranding of this, people started to think, well, we don't have propaganda around here. It's something the communists do, or it's something which you have perhaps in wartime, but not as run-of-the-mill in a democratic society. And since then, most of the time, propaganda, and it still has, it's essentially seen as a negative process. Now, I myself and David Miller and Vian Bakir and Eric Herring, we did an extensive review of the literature on propaganda and we published it in 2019 in Critical Sociology, and it's free to access actually. And we went through all of the literature, and we were very conscious that some people, and actually Mark Christopher Miller sort of holds to this position to an extent, this idea that sort of all forms of persuasion is a form it could be seen as propaganda. Some of that might become manipulative, but still, there are forms of persuasion which are not manipulative and which you can still call propaganda. I think where we landed on this review of the field that we conducted for Critical Sociology was that really it's good to keep a distinction between what we described as consensual persuasion, where you persuade somebody not by engaging any kind of manipulation of the facts, not through any kind of incentivization or coercion. You actually engage and try and persuade people in a way where they can freely choose to believe you or to freely act in a way that you want them to act. And that kind of persuasion shouldn't be called propaganda. That propaganda, should be preserved for forms of persuasion which start to become more manipulative, where deception starts to become involved, or lies, or where there's some kind of incentivization or coercion going on. And that fits with the common understanding of propaganda as a manipulative process, which is really, that was the case throughout the 20th century. So away from the original sort of Vatican idea of propagating the faith. And so we thought that distinction was worth keeping. Now, you don't have to. You could just say, well, let's just stick with this idea that all forms of persuasion is a kind of propaganda, right? But then you still need to maintain the distinction between propaganda, which is manipulative, and that which is not. And that's why we developed the framework we did and split between consensual and non-consensual forms of persuasion. And the ones which are problematic in democratic terms are obviously the ones where people are being lied to or pushed or cajoled into behaving in a particular way. I know that I've just gone through a massive run through of what's quite a big sort of theoretical debate within the field. But I'm going to throw in one more point to complicate this, is that even if you do recognize that distinction between persuasion which is consensual and persuasion which is propagandistic and non-consensual, you can still make a case in liberal democracies even to engage in propaganda under certain circumstances. So if you go into the literature on deception in politics, not that it's a particularly extensive literature, but people who have theorized this and written about this, at least in the last 50, 60 years, do talk about recognizing that, okay, there are situations where governments might be able to justify the need to engage in propaganda in order to serve the greater public interest. And so you can find circumstances where propaganda is allowable, but obviously, as a general rule within a democracy, you would want, if a democracy is to function properly, reflecting the will of the people, propaganda should be the exception to the rule. Maybe just to pick up on going back to where we were before, obviously we live in liberal democracies, and this goes back to why we set up Propaganda in Focus. We live in democracies where actually deception through lies, half-truths, misdirection, and also incentivization and coercion are so extensive in our societies that we don't really have functioning democracies anymore. We're not really free to do and free to choose in the way that we're supposed to be. Right. And that's primarily because of propaganda, because of the routine application and use of propaganda throughout liberal democracies. Deceiving, cajoling, incentivizing people, managing people. And that's why it's such an important topic to study.
Phenomenal.
But I hope that gives you and the viewers or the listeners a reasonable kind of overview of this question of what is propaganda and how we can understand it.
Yeah, it was phenomenal. Thank you so much for that. And I want to take a moment here to do our mid-program station ID. This is the Progressive Radio Network. This is the Bassline radio show. I have a few quick announcements in terms of how you can support this program. I'll try to be quick because we have a lot to talk about. March 29th, we're doing another 5 to 8 jam session. Please join us. This is a spring celebration. I'll be there with my electric bass, Kevin Nathaniel on mbira, Hassan Bakar on African percussion, and that is 274 Lenox Avenue at Rockmill Fitness. 274 Lenox, just south of 124th Street on Lenox Avenue. Frontierfarm.com, FRONTIERPHARM.com. Discount code The Bassline. They are leaders in the chlorine dioxide revolution. We spoke to Michelle Herman last week, who gave us a great intro into that topic. PrivateIPTVAccess.com. No reason to pay a cable bill ever again. You can have television from all around the world, watch all the sports, watch countries around the world, what their news coverage consists of. You have it on IPTV. So it's privateiptvaccess.com, and the code is Hosea, capital J, capital HOSEA. Please check me out on Substack.com, Jeremiah Hosea. Please subscribe. If you haven't already, please subscribe immediately. JeremiahHosea.com is where you can find my music. Of course, I'm also the founder of RemoteLearningChess.com, so please contact me for a chess lesson. I teach chess every day. I'm passionate about sharing the game. And, of course, End All Tyranny is our new X community. So please become a member. We're curating outstanding conversations every night. My co-hosts, Julie and Keith, are phenomenal to work with, and we have phenomenal speakers every night. So please join us tonight at 9 p.m. We're going to do the Bassline Extra, where we can continue the conversation we're having here right now. So thanks for listening to that. Those are the various means by which you can support this program. But now I want to get into, and also, almost forgot, if you want to call in and ask Dr. Robinson a question, please do. The number is 888-874-4888. Please get in the queue. We'd love to hear from you. We love the PRN audience, and it's always a delight to receive a call. So please call in 888-874-4888. But now we're going to move on to 9/11, which strangely is 911. There's an emergency happening. It's an amazing event that occurred that day, obviously a horrifying event. I have to admit I was somewhat of a latecomer to the truth movement. I had sort of taken the Chomskyan position that, if you're a big bully, eventually someone's going to come back and punch you in the mouth eventually. And I thought this was that moment. Although it did seem strange that these two giant buildings just collapsed in their own footprint. That seems strange. But I said, I don't know. There's just physical anomalies. Who knows? Who knows the explanation for that? But it was once I heard an interview with Webster Griffin Tarpley that I became more intrigued and started revisiting the subject, and I really enjoy his book, which is called 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in the USA. But without getting into my personal opinions about that subject, I just wanted to say that it's rather strange that we've been taught to not talk about 911 effectively, that as soon as you mention it, sort of like COVID, as soon as you mention it, you're a conspiracy theorist. Well, it's a historical fact that this happened with incredible ramifications. So how regrettable that people have been conditioned to not look into this more seriously. And one thing that I'll say before I pass the ball back to you, Dr. Robinson, is regardless of all the various details of what we could mention as it pertains to 9/11, one thing I'll say unequivocally is that the official report is hogwash. That what we were told occurred on that day, it doesn't pass the smell test. It doesn't withstand even slight scrutiny. So we don't have a serious account of what actually transpired on that day. Tell us about some of the important things that we might not be taking into consideration when we think about 9/11, and how did that event effectively change the world that we live in to this very day?
Well, I think the first thing to make clear with 9/11, it's a propaganda event. Huge amounts of propaganda surrounding it, and the event itself is a propaganda of the deed. It was designed primarily to initiate a series of wars in the international system. And that point you raised about it's such a shame that people can't even talk about this or have not been able to because they get accused of being conspiracy theorists. That, of course, has been a propaganda strategy of the authorities since the JFK assassination, of smearing people as crazy conspiracy theorists if they dare ask even the most eminently obvious, reasonable questions about, as you said, the 9/11 Commission report, which is clearly full of flaws. So this is very much to do with propaganda, and the event itself needs to be understood as propaganda. I mean, on the one hand, and we'll get into the sort of details of the work I do at the International Center for 9/11 Justice, but the event itself, and myself working as an academic and a researcher and looking at media and foreign policy and war, and there's no shame. You said you were a latecomer. I was a latecomer as well to realizing that the official story was clearly false. And I think it was about 2015, 16 that the penny started to drop for me, and I started to look more closely. But it was clearly the event, an event which was, and this is where this is as far as Chomsky was willing to go. Noam Chomsky was willing to go on 9/11, which it was an event which was then exploited and used to start wars in the international system, Afghanistan, Iraq. But then actually segueing through to Libya, Syria, and now Iran is now under assault from the West and from Israel. And these policies we know now because we know the clean break documents from the 90s, the Project for a New American Century. We know from the Chilcot Inquiry in Britain, which released a whole host of conversations between Bush and Blair. We know from Wesley Clark, the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, who said in 2006 that there was a list of countries that they wanted to take out within 5 years, 7 countries within 5 years of 9/11. It took a little bit longer to get to Iran because things didn't go according to plan. But this event is, as you said, it was a world-changing event, and it was exploited in order to start wars in the international system, wars which are running through to couldn't be more important and relevant to where we are now, with a major spreading war in the Middle East, in West Asia, with the attack on Iran, and then of course we just had the genocide in Gaza for 2 years, and now Israel, of course, has launched an invasion of southern Lebanon. So we're in foothills of World War III territory. But all of this goes back to the 9/11 and the wars which were started as a result of that. So it's an incredibly important event and incredibly relevant to understanding where we are now in the war, which none of us. Well, I know we're going to get to this later at the end of the conversation, but it's incredibly important for understanding how we got to where we are now. The reality of 9/11, and this reflects the work that I do with the International Center, but also as the editor, my co-editor Kevin Ryan, on the Journal of 9/11 Studies. The bottom line is that we know scientifically, and the evidence is very clear, that the buildings were demolished through controlled demolition. That the official story that planes hitting these towers caused them to weaken and collapse is demonstrably false. They were destroyed through pre-planned controlled demolition. The scientific evidence on that is extremely strong. Many organizations and groups have talked about this for many years now. There is a kind of consolidation of the 9/11 sort of truth research community at the moment, in the sense that we're working on a report which was instigated by Senator Johnson half a year ago to examine 9/11, and we're working on that report. And the question of the scientific evidence on the building destruction is the center point of that report. where that the unfortunate, and then what's the best way of thinking about this? It's a sad day when one realizes that this is what happened on 9/11, that America was not attacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists, that on 9/11 this was what you would describe as a black operation, a deep state operation, carried out by elements from our own side, within the US government, and obviously working with multiple countries, including Israel, including Saudi Arabia, in order to organize this false flag, is the term which is used in military circles, a false flag in order to mobilize the American public to support the wars which have been going on since then. This was, what are the other phrases which he used? It was an inside job, false flag, manufactured war trigger, all of these terms. But the bottom line is that's the unfortunate reality of 9/11. And of course, what that means for us as citizens in the West, of course, I'm in Germany, but I'm a British citizen, an American citizen. But really, this is relevant for all of us because we all are within the same geopolitical bloc in the international system. We're all on the same side. What this means is that we have a very big problem with the powers that be, that our governments aren't working in our interests, that there is a deep state, as Eisenhower warned the American public when he was departing from office, that there's a problem with a military-industrial complex, as he said, which is controlling and which is undemocratic and which is essentially, underpinning a permanent war machine. And obviously, in recent years, there's been a lot of talk about the relationship with Israel and the kind of cooperation between the Zionist elements, and that's the unfortunate reality we have on 9/11. And it took me a long time to get to it, and as you said, it took you a long time because it takes you a long time to see through all the propaganda, and also have the confidence to look at it when you know that if you look at it, you're going to be accused of being a conspiracy theorist. That's unfortunately what happened.
Right.
Now, we are at a point now where there's much more awareness of this. We've noted in the last couple of years, people such as Tucker Carlson, Jimmy Dore, have all been talking about 9/11. Tucker Carlson obviously had a series of this in the autumn. Other influencers like Candace Owens, who has a very big following, is openly talking about 9/11. And in a sense, as I said, Senator Johnson invited us to produce a report, or from the 9/11 Truth Movement, on what had happened. So there's clearly movement and awareness spreading about what happened on 9/11.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing, and I hope we will get there in terms of proper full recognition within the mainstream. We've got there on JFK now. I think there's a level of recognition that JFK was assassinated by the CIA, US deep state, and I think that recognition, is firming up now within the kind of the higher echelons of the power structure in the West, and I think we're going to get there with 9/11. And I know you wanted to talk about COVID-19. COVID-19 is not a million miles away from 9/11 in terms of being a very similar kind of event, instigated, exploited for political reasons. But we're getting there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So we already have a time crunch, but I want to get to the phones because I just love the spontaneity of live radio. That's why I don't really refer to this as a podcast in general, because it actually is the live radio format. And we have Zena from Brooklyn on the line. How are you, Zena?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Nice to hear from you.
Yes, nice to hear you. Okay, very succinctly today, I just want to say there's a book called The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America by Charlotte someone. I'm sure people can find it. With the advent of these initiatives or programs to dumb down America deliberately, came the how-to. I actually remember being ushered in. The how-to everything, how to comb your hair, how to brush your teeth. Okay, that was, as far as I was concerned, the prelude to the renting out of the space in your own mind. You can't figure anything out. You can't know anything instinctively. Someone has to tell you everything. And that's when propaganda proliferated itself, because you are always reading somebody else's opinion, so someone else's opinion carried more weight than the mind that God gave you. So we lost, we didn't lose it. We relinquished the right to think for ourselves. Because as far as I'm concerned, all the false flags that you mentioned were so overt. I mean, I could just spend infinite amount of time telling you all the holes that's in it because my mind wasn't rented out. My mind was focused on what was going on. So I say this with compassion. People have to recapture their own mind, and then it doesn't matter about the propaganda. You can believe your lying eyes, okay? You can trust the instinct. That's what inspiration and instinct is about, is God within. Okay, trust that. We got here. The people up in Africa are not going on the internet, but they are surviving and have survived since the beginning of time. We need to assume the responsibility for our own minds and our own thinking and stop going on the internet for everything, listening to other people's opinion, which is just that, other people's opinion / propaganda. They don't have to tell you how to live. They don't have to tell you how to brush your teeth. They don't have to tell you how to think. Only they do that because you allow it. So stop allowing.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen. Great call, Zena. Really appreciate those comments and those thoughts. And I think you're right on the money. We have a bunch of calls now. Let's hear from.
I was going to say,
please.
Jeremiah, you asked me about how we round up, advice to people,
right.
And what the caller just described is exactly the advice I give. And I used to give to students is that people need to develop the kind of confidence in their own intelligence and their own ability to see the truth. And a lot of propaganda is crude, and if you're independent minded and you think for yourself, you can see through it. And I think that's the big part of what we need to do as populations, citizens within a democracy, is to regain that kind of confidence in our own ability and intelligence to figure out what's going on, not to be led by people telling us how to think.
Yeah.
So I absolutely concur with your last caller.
Yeah, thank you. That's well said. And let's go to, I think that's my mom on line 2. How are you, Mom? Marsha McBroom is on the line. Are you there, Mom? Oh, we just lost her. Okay, let's go to Noel from Brooklyn on line 3.
Hi, Jeremiah. Just as an engineering standpoint, I called your engineer. You cannot hear the air signal when you're on hold to be up next. So stand by with people who, okay? So
right. Yeah, that happened to me, actually.
Yeah. Anyway, the reason for my call is the propaganda of politics. I tuned in late. Maybe you discussed it. For example, I want to tell the audience that I'm a black man, and I'm appalled when they talk about Barack Obama and they talk about what was the vice president's name again?
Kamala Harris.
Yeah. And she's a sister girl. And these are people who do the least for black people, and we go and vote for them in droves.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention about the propaganda of the word anti-Semitism. Now, it may offend some, and I don't care, that the people who claim to be Semitic are not even Semitic. So I'll just hang up, and I'll see you at the 528 one of these days, Jeremiah.
Okay, great. Well, always great to hear from you, Noel.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I concur with what you're saying. Go ahead, Piers.
Yeah, I'll pick up. I mean, the anti-Semitism smear has been weaponized and used for many, many years in order to shut down debate on Israel and on the Palestinians. And one of my colleagues, Professor David Miller, he writes, he's co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies, but also writes for Propaganda in Focus. He ended up being fired from the University of Bristol. There was a smear campaign against him by Zionist groups, and they managed to force him out of his job because he was, teaching and researching critically on Israel and Palestine. And that has been a perennial. I get the impression now that there's more awareness and the anti-Semitism smear doesn't have the kind of currency that it used to have. People realize that it's being used to try and stop people from questioning what is being done to the Palestinians, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
But for sure, it's as with the term conspiracy theorist, these are terms which are weaponized and then used in order to shut down debate, stop people from asking questions.
Absolutely. And I'll quickly plug my 2 articles. It's a sort of a 2-part series, articles I wrote on Substack. Conspiracy theory, what do you mean, is number 1. And then please check out Conspiracy theory, you're misusing the term. Those are 2 articles I wrote that I'm pretty proud of, and I'd love some feedback on those. But let's go to my friend Loretta is on the line from Florida. How are you, Loretta?
Hi, Jeremiah. Hi, Dr. Robinson. Excellent topic today. And, I'm a 1962 baby, so, we first TV we ever had was black and white. And I believe that that's probably one of the biggest propaganda machines that we invented was the TV. I mean, when they came out with the yo-yo, everybody wanted the yo-yo. When they came out with the hula hoop, everybody wanted the hula hoop. So I think that they were able to steer the masses in the directions that they have wanted them to. And when I became a mom, I was listening to people that were actually, like, cutting through the propaganda and sharing the truth of matters. And one of the main things for me as a young mother and having her children put in public schools was actually seeing what the people were sharing about the truth of schools, it happening right before my eyes, They were labeling children. They were giving them pharmaceuticals. The foods were not as good as when I was in elementary school. It was just, you could totally see that they were putting these kids on a conveyor belt of just follow directions, listen to what you're told, don't question anything kind of thing. So I felt very grateful and very, blessed by God to be able to pull my kids out of that situation so that they wouldn't. Well, my 4th grader came home and said, Mommy, the teacher says I don't read very well. And, of course, that's when they started all those aptitude tests and what have you and whatnot. But, what you're teaching and what you're sharing and what we're going to be able to propagate about propaganda out there, dividing the truth from the deceptions is just such an important thing this day and age, with everything that we're up against on a daily basis. So I appreciate Jeremiah, all the hard work and commitment that man has put into sharing the truth and with the most authentic people on his space, End All Tyranny. It's such a blessing to have someone like him and Julie and Keith to be able to open up a space for people to come into and not feel threatened by that, they're going to come in there and get, steered in one direction or not, but that we're openly able to share our own views, our own world views, and people can glean from it what they may. So I'm just thankful to Jeremiah, and I'm thankful for you, Dr. Robinson, for your work that you're doing with students. It's really, really much needed. So that's really what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much, Loretta. Great to hear from you, and really appreciate your support. It is heartfelt. And we're close to the finish line here. We only have 10 minutes, and I want to touch on a couple things here with Dr. Robinson. If you could give us some thoughts about COVID as a propaganda event. It seems to me like there's some very clear parallels between 9/11 and then fast forward just about 2 decades, a little more than 2 decades, and then it's the COVID event. And it seems like a major goal of the 9/11 event was to create the homeland security industry, and then it seems that COVID was then used to create the biosecurity state. What are some of your thoughts about COVID as a propaganda event, Dr. Robinson?
Well, I think that there are very clear parallels. My co-editor, Kevin Ryan, who's himself a 9/11 whistleblower, He's been in the 9/11 truth movement for a long time. But we wrote a paper a year and a half ago called a plausibility probe of COVID-19 and 9/11 as structural deep events. And so we were picking up on Professor Peter Dale Scott's concept of structural deep events, these events which are nefarious, carried out by deep state actors, and used in order to mobilize publics in particular directions and get them to do particular things. And, as we discussed before, 9/11 as a structural deep event, that's about getting people to support wars in the international system. And with COVID-19, I think it's a very similar, it's also a structural deep event. It shares similar features. You have a situation where an event occurs, it is then subject to propaganda. And so one of the things which became very apparent with COVID-19 early on was that it was the exaggeration of the nature of this virus and how dangerous it was. It was being used to justify lockdowns, and then of course that segued into requirements on injections, all, even on their own terms, completely unnecessary and over-the-top reactions. And then you had this kind of sort of running in parallel with this the medical restrictions was the sort of talk of digital ID and so on, and also the digital currency as well was something which was being pushed during that period. And what you tend to see is a number of political policies being advanced during COVID-19, and COVID-19 being used as the way of justifying that. And so, in the same way that 9/11 was used in order to justify these wars against various countries in the international system, I'd argue now, based on the work that I did with Kevin, but also work with other people such as Jessica Hockett are doing on COVID-19, is that the event is actually starting to look almost completely, as it were, constructed. Yeah. The idea of a novel, dangerous virus actually being in circulation is very weak. The evidence for that is almost non-existent. Mm-hmm. You don't have any kind of indications in the autumn of 2019 of death rates going up, for example. You have no evidence of a dangerous virus starting to spread. What you do have is that come January, you have a declaration that there is a novel virus, and then you have the PCR test, which was rushed through in mid-January. And after that, you then have these kind of figures being thrown around that we have this pandemic, and then you have the lockdowns following that. But prior to that, you don't have what you'd expect to see, which is people starting to die from this virus. Everything was back to front, so to speak. So the entire event, I think, evidence-wise, is starting to look as though it's constructed. It's not simply, for example, elites taking advantage of a real dangerous virus. It was elites actually constructing and exaggerating fear around this virus in order to push forward. As you said, I think that's the most accurate way of describing it in terms of the political agenda, trying to push forward the biosecurity agenda and the biosecurity state, and all of the ways in which that enables elite groups to get much more control over their population. Just as with 9/11, of course, the domestic consequence, or the primary domestic consequence of 9/11 was the Patriot Act. This was getting greater control, reducing levels of civil liberties, by getting control over the population. And I think COVID-19 was very much to do with that. I think it also, however, as a structural deep event, it also was one that a lot of people woke up to what was going on in volumes which are far greater than I've ever experienced. And I remember having this conversation with Mark Crispin Miller around 2020, and we were saying that sort of this is a huge, the PSYOP dimensions of COVID-19 are huge, but this is something which, are they actually going to be able to maintain the propaganda for any great length of time? And I think, there were huge protests against lockdowns, for example, and now there's what you would describe as a sort of COVID resistance globally. Multiple organizations which have pushed back against the policies and pushed back on the understanding of COVID-19 itself. And, those were things which, certainly for myself working on propaganda, but by late 2020, as COVID was, carrying on. I was noticing more and more people talking about propaganda within liberal democracies. I was seeing more and more people contacting me, asking me about propaganda. And I think, a large section of the population who hadn't woken up during 9/11 to propaganda and deception from their governments, I think a much larger swathe woke up during COVID-19. And I think that's still the case now. We have a lot of people, a large section of the population across the West, where people recognize there is propaganda. They recognize also that these are not this idea of crazy conspiracy theories. I mean, that's very difficult to maintain that kind of argument seriously, especially following the Epstein releases that we've seen. Even the most diehard liberals who have sort of stuck to the ground to this is all conspiracy theory and so on, and not a legitimate way of thinking about the way the world works. It's difficult to see if they have any place to hide now with the Epstein file release, which demonstrates, in a sense, what a lot of us have been saying for a long time, is that a lot goes on behind closed doors and we don't get to see what it is, and there's a lot of deception and nefarious activities. And so I think COVID-19 has crystallized I think a large swathe of the population, bigger than ever before. And I think you see that in terms of the lack of support and trust in mainstream media and in governments, and the large number of people who do go to alternative independent media for their information sources. That's a major shift, and it's positive, obviously, as a way I'm talking about it. Where it goes from here is maybe a debate for another time, but I think we are at this point where we have enough people who know to ask the questions, or as one of your callers said, to use their own intelligence. Maybe the current situation in Iran that we're seeing, and I know you wanted to maybe end on that, we have very low levels of US public support for the military operation, for the war against Iran. Joe Kent resigned, didn't he, 2 days ago? So there's an awful lot of turbulence in the machine. And so we'll have to see where this goes, obviously. But, in historical terms, this is a very low level of public support and belief in what the American government and what Trump, I guess, primarily is doing in terms of saying what the American public need to be prepared for. And prepared, I mean, they're talking about sending troops in now, aren't they? Boots on the ground. As a possibility.
Well, that would be a popular move.
I think, there's a lot of people who've woken up. So I don't think we're necessarily at a tipping point, but I think we are at a point where people are going to see through lies at a level that we haven't seen before. And that's a precursor to change, positive political change, I think.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Robinson. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today. Very fond of your work. Everyone, please make sure that you follow Propaganda in Focus on X. Look them up on YouTube, Substack. Go to the website propagandainfocus.com. Follow Piers Robinson. Subscribe to Dr. Piers Robinson on Substack. Please subscribe to me as well, and Gary Knoll's Substack. And we're out of time, but I want to wish you guys a great rest of your day. And please join us tonight on X, End All Tyranny, where we're going to have the Bassline Extra, and we're going to revisit this conversation that just took place in this past hour. So have a great day, everyone. Take care. Peace and love.